I'd like to take this time to introduce Charles Cutler, who's going to be defending his master's thesis today. Charles was part of our BS to MS program, which meant that he finished his master's degree, or will be finishing his master's degree in only a year and a half, which is a very big accomplishment, especially considering the fact that he has chosen the thesis option, as it's really tough to do a thesis, a good quality thesis within a year. And Charles, in my opinion, has done a good quality thesis. The way that the defense takes place is it's open to the public for the first hour. So Charles will talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be about 15 minutes for questions from everybody from the audience. And then we're gonna kick the audience out and have the committee members grill Charles for another 45 minutes to an hour. We then kick Charles out. We talk about him behind his back, and then we bring him in to give him the results of the of his defense. So without further ado, Charles.
So I'm Charles Cutler, and today I am going to present my work, Synthetic Data Generation for Named Entity Recognition. I would like to say thank you all for attending. And if at any point you have a question, go ahead and put your hand up and stop me, and I'll just field your question. I'll repeat it so that the Zoom can hear it, and then I'll go ahead and answer it. So at any point, just stop me and ask your questions. So let's begin. The center of my project is about named entity recognition. A named entity is a word or phrase belonging to a specific category. And recognition is just the identification of something or someone. And so together, named entity recognition is the identification of words or phrases belonging to specific categories. But let's walk through a simple exercise together. On July 20th, 1969, a date, NASA, an organization, successfully landed the Apollo 11 lunar module on the moon, where Neil Armstrong, a person, became the first man to walk on the lunar surface, which is a location. And so here we see 4 different named entities, each belonging to a different category, being labeled, those categories being date, organization, person, and location. And as the amount of digital text on the internet and out in our society is increasing, the ability to recognize entities that we would like becomes increasingly important. Named entity recognition of unstructured text allows us to build systems like information retrieval or question answering, or systems such as voice assistants like Siri. Voice assistants are trained to recognize hundreds of named entities. And you can think every time you want to create a new event on your phone, you ask it, date, time, location, people, locations, etc. And every time you want to, introduce a new feature with your voice assistant, you have to give it some new entity types to recognize, hey, I want to do X, Y, Z. I need to be able to recognize what you're talking about. For example, hey Siri, go ahead. Where is JAWS showing? There are jaw bones currently on display at the Richmond Dental Museum. How many times has this happened to you? I'm talking about the movie JAWS, but here Siri thinks I'm talking about jaw bones and says, well, they're at the display at the dental museum. So you would think, well, Siri would benefit from recognizing new entity types such as movie titles in this case, so that way you could just take your phone and order a movie ticket right there. However, Siri, you would think, probably not feasible to train an entirely new version from scratch every time I want to build a new feature. And so we might want to instead expand Siri's knowledge incrementally, which brings us to the idea of continual learning. Continual learning studies the problem of learning new information incrementally without forgetting anything that you've learned before. Imagine that this is your brain, and I want to teach you many different things, such as science and math, English and art, history, and even music. Importantly, as you learn each one of these new things, you retain the information that you've learned on the previous subjects. And so as you are a student, you build your knowledge incrementally, and when you graduate, you're very happy you've learned many things. But how would continual learning look for an NER model? Here, we're going to see a continual learning model for named entity recognition. As we train the model on more data, we see that the model is able to recognize an incrementally larger amount of named entity types. For example, date, organization, and person, we showed another data set that learns location. notice we've retained all of the entity types we've learned before. And we can even learn some new ones like spacecraft or celestial objects. The ultimate goal is to gradually extend the model's knowledge acquired without forgetting anything that is previously learned. Unfortunately, continual learning is hard for computers, unlike it is for humans. You would think, I have a model, it's good at people, locations, and organizations, and all I want to teach it is one more new thing. So I'll go out, I'll collect some data on that new item, I'll give it to my model, and we're done. But unfortunately, that introduces something called catastrophic forgetting. Catastrophic forgetting is, I have a model, I show it some new data, and now I experience the severe degradation of performance on things that I've already taught the model. So I can't just go get new data for the new object. What about going out and getting data for everything that I haven't learned, right? It knows people, locations, organizations. I'll just go get new data. I'll label it for all of the things I wanted to learn and just train a new model. Unfortunately, that is very expensive, error-prone, and time-consuming, especially as the number of entities that you want your model to recognize grows. And so then what about, I train the model once, I probably have all that data lying around. Why can't I just use the data I have before, add some new stuff to it, and start all over again? But unfortunately, especially if you work with some sort of medical domain, you can't always have access to the data again. You have privacy concerns, as well as maybe data storage concerns. Additionally, if I'm working in a company and I publish a model that works really great for general named entities, and I am a researcher and I want to now teach it some specialized, like spacecraft or celestial objects, I don't have access to the training data that they used to produce their model, but I do have access to their model. And it would be nice if I could take that and somehow expand its knowledge. And so with these three problems making it hard, people have come up with a set of different methods that try to do continual learning from models. And we're going to look at one of them. It's called generative replay. Generative replay uses a generator to create synthetic data that looks like data for stuff that you've previously learned. And I have an example that we can use to give you a better idea. This is an image recognition model. And for now, let's call that box what the model knows. If I show it pictures of dogs and cats, and I train the model, we would expect it to be able to recognize dogs and cats in images. And now if I wanted it to recognize boats and cars, well, in this scenario, the dog-cat model, when I show it pictures of boats and cars, well, it forgets boats and cars, or dogs and cats, and it only learns boats and cars. And generative replay says, if I have a generator, I'm going to generate synthetic data that looks like previously learned information. In this case, fake dogs and fake cats. So we take our fake dogs, our fake cats, our real boats, and our real cars, and we take our previously trained dog-cat model, and I show it this set of data where I've generated some synthetic data. Our model is actually able to sort of retain dogs and cats and also now learn boats and cars. And so now the question becomes, but what about generative replay for named entity recognition? Well, we conducted a literature review of continual learning and continual learning for named entity recognition. And what we discovered was, despite the popularity of things like GPT-4, the underlying model for ChatGPT Pro, and things like Meta's Llama, these popular large language models that generate text have never been used to create synthetic training data for named entity recognition. So this critical gap, this absence of generative large language models for this field of synthetic data generation was a promising avenue for exploration. And this work today focuses on what is the foundation of a generative replay approach for NER. We will determine the efficacy of using ChatGPT produced synthetic data, and we would like to see if we could supplement NER systems with such data. And so we have a few research questions that we wanted to answer. The first is, can synthetic data be generated to actually mimic the output of, mimic real NER data? NER data is structured, it has a sort of format, and sometimes ChatGPT gives you good answers, sometimes it gives you bad answers. So can we even use it, GPT, to give you data that is in the right format? And then if you can, is it somehow actually similar to real, authentic NER data, right? The meaning of the words, the construction of the sentences, it somehow means something. And we want to know, does what the generator create, is it similar to real data? And then, as I mentioned, right, you might ask ChatGPT a question and get a really great answer, and then you might ask a different question and get a really bad answer. And so that is called prompting. You query the model. And we wanted to study the effect of two different prompting strategies on the effect of the models that we're going to train later. Does it really matter how you ask the model to create data for you? And does that impact the performance of the model trained on that data? And so then, we want to mix the data and see how well that can help the model. And even we want to measure or determine, can we just replace our training data with only synthetic data? Can we only use the outputs produced from a generator? And we don't even have to go out into the world and collect any real data, really, to train our models. And so to answer all of these questions and to build the foundation, it's necessary first to have a suitable data set of authentic data to work with. We used the Text Analysis Conference Systematic Review Information Extraction 2018 dataset. Big, long thing, but essentially it's a data set of methods and materials sections of journal articles that are relating to experiments about toxicity and health effects on environmental agents on animals. So this data set of these environmental studies on animals, we chose it because for one reason, it's non-trivial. It has these entities that you would expect a generative model to not already be good at. People, locations, organizations, it's pretty straightforward. You can ask ChatGPT and you would expect it to get locations correct, dates correct, people names, something like that. But this data set contains entities that are not as easy. So that's one criteria that made it a promising choice. The other one is that this domain needs improvement. There are not really models that are performing at the level that these experts in the biomedical and biological domains are happy with their models. And so this area said, well, we could probably help them out. If what we do works, then they can do more research. So this data set, it's nice, it has non-trivial entities, and it is something that we probably could help other people with. And so specifically, we looked at, so the data set has 7,400 sentences in it, and it's actually annotated for 24 different categories, but we focused on some in the animal group, specifically these three: cell line, group name, and species. And now you're probably wondering why those three. Well, those three are special. We observe some natural occurring scenarios within NER. Specifically, if we train a model in the non-continual learning sense to just recognize some named entities, we would find that not all of them are as easy to recognize as some of the other ones. Some you do well, some you do poorly. And so actually there are sort of three occurring scenarios. One, you have a lot of data for this entity type. And as a result, your sort of baseline non-continual learning model performs well. The second, you have a lot of data, but for some reason, your NER model is actually performing poorly on this sort of entity type. And then the third is you don't have a lot of data and your baseline model performs poorly. So we actually conducted an experiment with a baseline model. We took some portion of that whole TAC data set for all 24 of these, and we trained it. And we used this thing called F1 score to evaluate the performance, whether it's high or low. I'll talk about F1 score a little bit later. But we saw in the animal group all three of these scenarios. For the first one, species was our well-represented and our high baseline performance. For group name, it was well-represented but performed poorly. And for the cell lines, we saw it was poorly represented and also performed poorly. So these three were perfect. It's exactly what we're looking for. It's all sort of in the same category as well. So it was a nice choice to pick these three. And so what is a species, a group name, and a cell line actually refer to? Well, here's an example from the TAC dataset. 6-week-old male ZDF rats is a species, were housed with free access to feed and water, acclimatized for 1 week, randomized into vehicle and treatment groups. So group name sort of refers to the word that describes the experimental groups. You might think control group, vitamin A, vitamin B. If I have some study, those words themselves would be of the group name type. And then administered vehicle water or CNX11 respectively for 7 weeks. And for cell line, you can imagine it's something like HeLa cells or some specific cell line that researchers are interested in, A549, sort of just a word followed probably by the word cells. And so we have this nice data set. We sort of looked at it. We see what these types of entities are referring to, but to actually be able to use it for our experiments, we first had to take it, clean it up, and convert the format, because there's one format of data that's really great for human annotators to go out and collect and mark it up. And then there's another format that's really great for training models. Actually, it's necessary. So we had to do this conversion. And once we've converted it, we filtered it for each one of those three types, species, cell line, and group name independently. And then we split it up into training, validation, and testing. The training set is used to actually train your model. The validation set allows us as the researchers to help pick a good performing model. And the test set is what we'll actually give the models at the very end once to collect results and report them as sort of how good our model was and compare it to other people out in literature. And then optionally, we're going to talk about supplementing this training set with synthetic data that we've generated. So with our suitable data set in hand, let's talk about generating synthetic data. It is necessary first to get outputs from a generative model to prompt it. Often if ChatGPT, you go and type up a question, but in our case, we would need to provide it some sort of information to ask it to generate data for us, and we call these prompts. And specifically, we use something called 5-shot prompts. And I want you to just imagine that a prompt, 5-shot refers to the fact that we gave it 5 examples of real data within the actual prompt itself. The idea being we want it to see an example of what it's supposed to generate for us. Essentially, you can think about, I gave it context. I want you to generate 5 examples of species. Here are 5 examples that contain species. And to actually come up with and create these prompts, we followed 2 different prompting strategies or prompting styles. The first we call the ad hoc prompt. You see it here on the right. Dr. McInnes and I came up with this prompt ourselves, this prompting strategy. The second you see here on the left is known as the knowledge entity extraction or key prompting strategy, which is from a paper, Shao et al. 2024. We said, well, these seem reasonable. We found one in literature. We came up with one on our own. We're going to see how well they do. But each prompting strategy themselves is essentially just a different mixture of general components that you sort of put together, like the Lego blocks. I have a task description block. I have this other block, and you put them together, and it describes how you're actually going to write your prompts. And so we can take a look closer at what each of these sort of Lego blocks looks like. The key has all 5, so we'll look at this one. On the right, you see sort of just the whole prompt that was actually created. And what I want you to look at as we go through this is sort of just the general locations of each of the blocks within the prompt and sort of details that are up there. So task description. This is the fun one. You ask the large language model, hey, you are an experienced biologist. You know all the things about biology. And you are really good at recognizing named entities. You essentially ask the model to role play as something that is in the domain that you're asking it for. Additionally, this is where you define sort of the introduction to, here's what I want you to do, and this is the format I want you to produce outputs in. And then you use the entity definitions to provide specific definitions of what the entities mean in your domain. Right, we're talking about this biological domain. The word species has a specific meaning. This is the section in which we provide a specific definition of the entity type for the model to understand in our domain, this is what it means to be a species. After that, use the task emphasis to pretty much add additional rules. Hey, every sample has to be a specific length. When you produce a sample, make sure that the words that are actually species are aligned with the data labels that are actually species, et cetera. You sort of give extra rules to follow. The task examples, those are those 5 shots or 5 examples of real data that we provided in the prompt. And then the prompt itself is where we ask it, generate for me some synthetic data. And so we used our 2 prompting strategies made up of these Lego blocks, and we created a number of prompts for each of the different entities we were studying. Specifically, we created multiple prompts with different examples to help increase the diversity of the synthetic data produced by the generative model. For the species, we created 10 of the ad hoc and 10 of the key. The same is for group name, 10 of each. And then for cell line, we created 2 of each. And if you recall, cell line was the one that was poorly represented. And that comes into play why here. But we set an upper bound of 10 because our thought was, if synthetic data works well on its own, you don't have to go out and collect a lot of data, right? You don't have the time, it's expensive, and doing it can be error prone. So if we can use maybe only 10 prompts where each one has 5 examples, you only have to go collect 50 sentences, and then you generate a bunch of data and your model's good. So the idea was maybe limit how much real data we actually need in the case that it would work out well. And for the cell line, we were limited by the number of suitable examples that were in the data set. It's poorly represented. We wanted to extract some examples and we found, well, there's not that many, so we were limited. But what makes an example sentence in the data set suitable to be used in a prompt? Well, we extracted these examples, which are also called exemplars, from the unfiltered version of the TAC data set. So it has all these 24 entities. And we considered an instance suitable specifically if it contained only the entities for the type we wanted to generate. So if we looked at a sentence and everything in the sentence is not an entity except for maybe a couple of words are cell line, that would be considered suitable. But if you saw a sentence that had cell lines and group names and something else, that would not be suitable for either one of those types. But we only want to see cell line and the rest we call them O or other or non-entity types. And once we had our extracted exemplars, we made sure that they were only placed in the training set, right? We're going to generate data using these exemplars. And we don't want to then put that example sentence in the test set and then the model goes, wow, we're really great. Of course you're great. You use that sentence to generate synthetic data. So as to be consistent and not be, not cheat on the test, we made sure all of the examples were placed in the training set. And then on top of that, we kept them the same sort of paired 5 shots across each of the prompting strategies. For example, the first 5, prompt 1 of each strategy, the next 5, prompt 2 for each strategy. So it's consistent. Yes. Sure. So the question was, why did we create our own prompting strategy as opposed to the key strategy that was in literature? Well, so we started the process just prompting the model for outputs. And then as we were finishing up our literature review, we realized, well, in 2024, like this was right in February as we're closing up the literature review, we noticed this paper was just published with this prompting strategy for entity recognition. So, wow, that's a good idea. Let's take this one, and with that observation in hand that sometimes you get better answers than other, let's take this one, let's come up with one on our own and just see, does it matter? Does the prompting strategy actually impact the generated data, or does it not really matter? And there's something else maybe that impacts it. So essentially, we just wanted to find out, explore. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
So with the 5 examples, if I have fixed 5 examples, I can still have 2 different prompts under KE, but 3 different prompts under KE. The KEE, the first one.
Okay.
Is that correct?
No. So the KE prompting strategy is very specific. It has.
If you fix number of examples, you can only have one specific KEE prompt and no other version, even if the English language changes.
Well, so.
The examples there are stuff. That part I keep fixed.
Yeah.
But the first part where I'm writing in English what it is about.
Yeah.
I can have a different version.
That's true. That's true. The way you implement each of those Lego blocks, each of those general components, the way you decide to write them can change, right? Within either one of those prompting strategies. But once you sort of come up with a way that you want to write it, you would probably want to keep it the same across all of those. Yeah.
But that's still an unsolved problem, I believe.
Correct.
It's a huge set of possible prompts that I can generate with the same 5 examples.
That's correct. That's correct. And for actually writing the English sentences that went into those general components, we followed sort of very, very closely the Xiao et al. 2024 verbiage that they had explored. But you're correct. We could phrase our definitions differently, or even the way we ask the model for its output. Put it into this format. Maybe you describe the format as a Python dictionary, but if you described it as a JSON, it might do better, right? Something left to explore. Absolutely. So we've seen all of the examples, all of the pieces of the synthetic data generation process. What's a prompt? We've seen the 2 prompting strategies that we've used and defined the components for them. We've talked about selecting examples and sort of the criteria for them and what we did with them once we've got them. But we can kind of look at the whole process as a whole right here. So we extract our examples, and then we create our prompts for both of our prompting strategies as defined previously. And then for each of the prompts, we're going to query GPT-4 in our case to get an output. And our query process was as follows. We have an initial query And that's simply giving the model the prompt, and it gives me an output. And then after that output, we said, create 5 more samples. And then it gave me an output. Create 5 more, gave me an output. Sort of went back and forth like this. Gives me an output, I ask for 5 more, and we repeat until we get to 50 samples. And we save them to a file. And then we do it again for the exact same prompt. We want to get 100 samples for this prompt, so we do this process to get 50, we save them, then we repeat, and we get 50 more. And once we've saved all of our prompted outputs, we had to do a little bit of restructuring. Sometimes the model can be very verbose. You ask it, what's 2 plus 2? It tells you the answer to your question is that 2 plus 2 is defined by the following lemma. All I wanted to say was 4. So even producing the outputs that we wanted, sometimes it was quite verbose, and we had to remove things like that. Once we've done that, though, we get something very beautiful, very, very beautiful. This is some synthetic data that was generated for us. And here we see a sentence that's been split up into words, and we have the labels, and we see zebrafish is appropriately labeled as a species. We're very happy. We're very happy. We had a lot of things like this, and we're going to go on using them. But before, I want to talk about why we did 50 2 times over, as opposed to what might be natural. Why don't you just ask it for 100 by getting 5 more at a time and then saving them? We had to do it for a very specific reason. It's called output semantic drift. So we queried it 50 times, 50 samples 2 times over because of this problem. So essentially, the output produced further from the initial prompt sort of drifts farther and farther away from what you actually desire. For example, we had group names that were initially produced at the beginning as vitamin A, vitamin B, control, etc. Right? These are appropriate group names. But by the 100th sample, we had group names like the dogs with a job group, which is not necessarily what we're looking for, right? We want appropriate group names. And so we decided, Dr. Chang and I sat down and we said, well, how do we fix this problem? Well, we said, why don't we just ask it to generate less and then try that again? And that seemed to work well to combat output semantic drift, keeping the outputs closer to the prompt overall. Did we quantify the outputs? So Dr. Gosha was asking about, did we somehow measure this amount of semantic drift? We did not. There's not, as far as I know, a clear way to measure the output semantic drift. All you are looking at in the outputs are, for some reason, all of these sentences now don't make sense. It's like from a cartoon or something, right? Or dogs with a job. So we qualitatively observed it, and we decided, if I can't automatically detect it, there's not really a clear way to quantify it. Why don't we just scale back and see if we observe it again? And what we did was we scaled back 75. Oh, it's still there. Scale back to 50. Seems to be gone. So let's just go with that and keep on going. But yeah. So, so we've got our freshly. Oh yes, Spencer. So interestingly, so the question was, if we are prompting, with the same prompt over again, do we kind of get repeat data for that same prompt? And what's really cool with generative models is they have this parameter, sort of this knob you could control called temperature. And when the temperature is set to 0, every prompt you give it gives you the exact same answer if you're using the same prompt. So I ask it a question, it gives me the answer. If I ask it the same exact question, it will give me the same exact answer. If I take this knob and I turn it really high up to 1, which is actually 2, I think is the highest, 0 to 2. If I set it to 2, I give it a question, it gives me an output. If I give it the exact same question, it could be telling me about something completely unrelated. It basically, you think about the randomness or diversity of the outputs produced. And so naturally, we set the default parameters at 1. So we left it at 1. So when you prompt it, it gives you reasonable but different outputs. So even with the same prompt, the second set of 50 is different from the first set, which is kind of what we're looking for. So with our synthetic data freshly created, we can conduct our experiments and answer those research questions that we mentioned earlier. We created 4 versions of each of the filtered TAC data sets. The baseline is essentially the filtered real training data. The combined gen takes the real training data for that filtered entity and takes all of the synthetic data we created for each prompting style independently and puts it together. And we're going to train a model using that set. The combined gen small is essentially a random 10% of the synthetic data that's just been selected and added to the authentic data. And then replace gen is the interesting one with no authentic data and is only going to be trained on synthetic data. And again, these were done independently for ad hoc and key. And to conduct our experiment, we used this model to actually, this is what we were training. So we can walk through each of these components that you're seeing here. The first, all the way on the left, is just a sentence. And it's been broken up into words already for this picture, but the sentence is going to be fed into what is called a tokenization layer. And tokenization would normally also split a sentence into words, but you can also imagine if I have a word like played, P-L-A-Y-E-D. Play and the suffix ed might be broken apart into two separate tokens, and that's handled by the tokenization layer as well. And with all of our tokens in hand, we're going to pass them into, in this case, something called DABERDA. And what I want you to think, DABERDA essentially takes a token and it produces for us a nice vector of numbers that hopefully capture the meaning of that token. Think about two words like doctor and physician. Once you have these vectors produced by DABERDA in what we call semantic space, you would hope that these two words, doctor and physician, appear together. And words that like dog and cat, those vectors would appear in semantic space sort of not as close together. Maybe not so far because they're both animals, but they're not as close as doctor and physician. And with our vectors in hand, each of these kind of containing the numerical meaning of the meaning of the word in numbers, we're going to put them through a linear layer. The linear layer looks at one vector at a time, sort of we do it in parallel, but take a vector and we look at each of these parts, we call them features. And in this case, it's going to try to learn how the features are important to actually producing the output label that we want. So the vector represents what the word means. If we look at all of the parts of it, we pass it through this network, it should be able to tell us, oh, look, that word's rats. Rats is a species, and that's what we want the linear layer to do. And we've included the softmax layer because the outputs of the linear layer, when you put them through a softmax, they sort of give you a very natural interpretation. They are probabilities. They add up to 1. And so now if I pick a label like species, out of this softmax layer, if I pick it, I can say we picked it because it was 90% probably a species. Subtoken combination just handles that sort of, we split up play into play and ed. You got to put those back together to get a nice prediction per each of the words in our sentence. Yes.
Can you say a little more about the semantic space? Sort of how long is the vector, and
Sure.
Did you come up with the meanings of the different components of the vector, or did that come from somewhere else?
Sure. So Dr. Cranston is asking about what is semantic space, the meaning of the vectors, and sort of more about the size and the dimensions of the space. So in this case, DABERDA, the vectors are 1024 dimensional. It's hard to picture what that is, but essentially they're 1024 dimensional. The meaning of each of those features is something that we don't have. It's produced from this specific model, and it's not like a direct, the first feature is because it's a noun, and the second feature is because it's something. We don't have a specific meaning. There is no meaning. It is meaningless. The only thing that matters is that in this semantic space, this 1024 dimensional space, vectors that are supposed to represent words that are the same should be close together, and vectors that are supposed to represent words that are different should be different. Yeah. So this is the model architecture that we actually used to train, and we trained it in this process. We have our authentic data, and we either create some synthetic data and put it together, or we don't. Baseline, combine gen small, or replace gen. We actually train our model, and we look at the outputs, and when it gets it correct, great. When it misclassifies a word, we can actually compute a value that allows us to tell the model to update itself and correct itself so that the next time, hopefully it's better. And we repeated our training procedure for 10, what we call epochs. So it's essentially a look over the data. So it looked over the data 10 times and it updated itself, hopefully getting better at each time. And we would take, using that validation set, actually, we could take the best set of parameters that it was trained during the training process. And so we've seen the authentic data, what we did to it. We've seen the synthetic data, how we generated it. We have seen an example. we've seen the experimental setups. We've talked about the model, and we've talked about how we trained the model. But how do we evaluate whether a model is actually a good model for this task or not? In this case, NER models are evaluated using sort of generally 3 metrics: precision, recall, and F1 scores. Precision is the ratio between correctly predicted mentions and the total set of predicted mentions for a specific entity in this case. So if you think about it, how many of the words that are species, that it predicted were species, were actually species? And then recall is the ratio of correctly predicted mentions over the actual total number of mentions. So in this case, of all the words we said, or of all the words that are supposed to be species, how many of them did we actually get? And then F1 score is a single measure that sort of combines these 2, precision and recall. And it's traditional to report F1 for NER models, with nice single number to tell you the performance on that entity type. And what's important here, precision and recall F1, they're great. They tell us about the performance of the model, but NER is a challenging task. Most things are actually not entities, and we call this class imbalance. And because it's imbalanced, right, most words or phrases are not entities that you're interested in. They're they're other or non-entity types. And because of this class imbalance, there are sort of 2 additional metrics that when you want to quantify the overall performance of your model across a number of entity types, including the O, there are 2 sort of general metrics you can use that sort of handle the imbalance differently. In this case, it's important to note that because O is so prevalent, models tend to like O, and that's going to come into play. So macro F1 treats all of the classes, O, species, etc. It treats it independently. Whereas micro F1 makes no distinction between classes and considers the number of entities that are for them in the data set. So micro is going to say, well, O has a lot of entities in the data set, which it's weird to call O an entity, but there are not, O non-entities, there are a lot of them. So my micro score is going to be very high compared to my macro score because models like to predict O. O is most things anyway. So the micro takes that into account, but macro treats them independently. So regardless of how many there are, it's going to just look at the performance and aggregate them. So we know how to evaluate the models, and now we can actually talk about the good stuff, the results, whether it worked or not. And so here we have the species results from our experiments. We achieved a baseline performance of 0.96 macro F1. And when we included all of the synthetic data, as well as that random 10% for the combined and combined gen small experiments, we saw that there was really no fluctuations in the macro F1 score. They're very consistently on par with the baseline. But when we excluded all of the authentic data and we only looked at synthetic data, for the ad hoc, we achieved F1 for that specific class here. Class entity would be species in this case. For that specific class, we achieved about 0.4. And for KEE, we achieved about 0.3. So sort of a very limited ability to recognize the species entity type when you only use synthetic data. And we can actually look at more closely sort of maybe the reasons why that this was the case. And while we do, I want you to remember, ad hoc for species, 0.4, KE for species, about 0.3. So we can actually cluster. So remember, I told you those vectors are 1024, but there's a process that you can use to reduce the dimensionality of them to 2. And if you do that, you can make these very pretty pictures that I'm going to show you a bunch of. And these pictures, the blue dots represent those sort of shrunken down vectors for each of the words in the data set that are actually a species, the real authentic data. And the black X's that are there that may not be easy to see are the exemplars that we extracted. And to do this, we used the DiBerta, create those vectors, and then we shrunk them down. And we can add to this plot the ad hoc data. So these are the shrunken down vectors for the synthetic ad hoc data. And what we see here is that over to the left in this sort of reduced semantic space, there are entities of the ad hoc present right there amongst the authentic data. But we also see, unfortunately, that there's this divergence up and to the right, this tail of synthetic data that's up there where there's not really a lot of authentic data. The same happens for KEE, but notice the KEE seems to be even more divergent up and to the right, away from the authentic data. I can actually show you both here, and across both of them, they're slightly grouped over there to the left. You know, it's useful. There are some good ones that are all within the authentic data, and then there's this divergence up and to the right. And the difference in performance, we speculate, is because ad hoc, 0.4, had more samples that were closer to the authentic than key, which had this more prevalent divergence away. So it sort of explains one performed better because it produced data that was more representative. Yes?
This trend keeps growing as you keep increasing the synthetic.
Well, so we did not say, given some amount of data, produce even more and see what happens, you know, and it would be interesting. We also want to look at which of the samples in the process, remember I told you about the semantic drift. It would be interesting to label, are the points that are far away, are they farther away from the prompt, right? It's something that we want to investigate. Yeah.
And they say that don't compare with the same size of synthetic and authentic. Keep growing synthetic data 5-fold or 10-fold larger than authentic data. And that's where you may actually see something even better performance coming from. That's what that does. I don't quite know how that's going to work with the prompt engineering.
Sure.
Something you may want to try.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes.
The ad hoc design, is that because it's 0.4 versus 0.3, is yours technically slightly better? Like, could the people who made the key then take your design and use the training models and data that they did in your ad hoc and get different/better data?
So the question was regarding the performance difference between the two prompting strategies. And what I would say to that is we're going to talk about a little bit more in a little bit specifics about the prompting strategies. In this case, the difference between 0.4 and 0.3, I would just consider them both bad, right? They're both bad. The models are not able to recognize species well. They're both bad. And we're going to look at this sort of, if you treated them as some, like 0.4 is somehow better than 0.3, even though they're both bad, and you would say, well, then somehow mine is better. We're going to look at whether that's the case always or whether or not, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. Yes. Yes, yes, the axes, the x-axis is the principal component, number 1, and the y-axis is the principal component 2. We use the process called principal component analysis to sort of look at those 1024 dimensional vectors and produce for us, basically reduced it to two principal components that sort of hopefully capture all of the information within those big vectors, right? And so for now, just the x is the first one and the y is the second one. Yeah. So this is the species, but we can actually look at this sort of same idea with cell line. For cell line, we achieved a baseline of 0.73 macro F1. And when we added synthetic data, 0.71 and 0.75, it's on par, right? This is right there on par with our baseline model. But when we added a random 10%, we saw for ad hoc, it was on par. But for KEE, we actually were able to improve performance slightly to achieve a macro F1 of 0.8. And if we look at the replaced gen for both of them, sort of bad, 0.26 and 0.08, not really able to recognize cell lines at all. But with one of those cases, we saw a small improvement. And the reason for that, again, we can look at these clusters. And here is, in light blue, the authentic data for cell line. You can see there is not very many points here, very poorly represented within the data set. And the X's there are the exemplars that we actually extracted. If we add to it the ad hoc data, we see that it follows sort of this general trend, but it has some points that diverge in semantic space kind of above the group of authentic data. For key, we see that it's in pink, we see that it's following the trend again, and there are sort of less points that are straying away from the top of them in semantic space. So if you look at both of them, overall, they both kind of follow this trend, and there do seem to be a non-trivial, non-negligible amount of entities that kind of diverged away from the authentic data. But the key data performed so strong in this case because it was more like the authentic data. And when we took the random 10%, we had a higher chance of getting data that looked more like real data than with the ad hoc. So in small experiments, that's sort of why key performed better. You had a higher chance of getting more realistic looking data, but performed better, and it sort of helped us. Overall, with the with the group name experiments, we achieved a baseline performance of 0.53. And when we added in all of our synthetic data, we improved largely over 0.53, right? We got a 0.9 and 0.87 for ad hoc and key respectively. And even for the small experiments, we saw, for now, this is basically the same, 0.8 for both of the small versions, which is better than 0.53. And with the replaced gen, we're sort of, just like the baseline, kind of bad at group names, and the macro F1 scores report that. So why did group name perform so much better than its baseline? And we can look, here's the authentic group names that have this sort of arc-shaped or banana-shaped trend in the reduced semantic space. And again, the black X's denote the exemplars. And look at this. We add in those synthetic entities and we see, wow, they are sort of in this middle of the banana. Same idea for the KEE, though they sort of diverge more below the group. And so we see, well, they're both clustered in that area and they are matching mostly this banana-shaped trend. Interestingly, they fill in that middle area where we had sparse authentic data and now we have this kind of low variance synthetic data within this area. So synthetic data that looks a lot like itself and is also sort of within where we didn't have a lot of authentic data. And that's why we performed better, right? The model got more information on what it was missing and was able to recognize group names better. And so we speculate that this performance did so well because both of these sort of did that nice fill-in property. And so, in conclusion, we can now answer our 5 research questions. Can synthetic data be generated to mimic the format of authentic NAR training data? We prompted a model a bunch of times. Dr. McInnes and I, Dr. Chang, we looked at this output and we found out, yes, here's an example of it, right? We were successful in generating usable output. And in fact, remember, normally we have these problems of error-prone, expensive, time-consuming, right? But we did it cheaper than human annotation. And so it was a nice, good answer for the first question. So then you wonder, well, was it similar to the authentic data that was actually in the data set? And we did those clustering experiments and showed you all these beautiful pictures. And what we found was some of it, hold on, the slide takes a little bit, get some pictures on. Yes, somewhat the data is, looks like the real data, and some of it doesn't, right? Some of it fills in nicely, but with species, diverged up and to the right. So that maybe not the greatest, but some of it does, yeah. And so then how do those, as my sister asked, how do these prompting strategies sort of affect the performance? One case, our prompting strategy was better, but is that always the case? And we found, well, there's not really one best prompting strategy. In 7 of the experiments where they've had different performance, the ad hoc performed best 3 times and the key performed best 4 times. And the other 2 experiments, they tied. No clear key is the answer, ad hoc is the answer. We talked about sort of how these prompts could even vary more. So there's a lot of open exploration still in this direction. But we saw this sort of no clear winner. Does adding synthetic data help? Well, we did a bunch of experiments and we found, well, yeah, it helps, or at least it doesn't hurt, right? Here's a baseline for species, and when we added it, we got the baseline, so that's good. For cell line, here's the baseline, and we actually improved on the baseline. And then for group name, the same thing, right? Here you're seeing the baseline compared to the best model in each of the experiments. So I would say this is a yes. Yes.
This is not a, we cannot say that adding synthetic data will never decrease the performance.
That's true. That's true. Right. And we want to actually conduct, as you'll see, we sort of stepped out a few more experiments to sort of help formalize whether this finding is always true or if it was just true in our case. Yeah, yes.
Have the baseline, and then what's the benefit of having created your synthetic data if you're getting the same performance after you've had it?
Right. So in the case of species, right here where we achieved the on par, there was no clear benefit to actually adding to synthetic data. But what we want to do is, because we've noticed this divergence, what if we only added the best samples? Could we go above 0.96? So there's still some room to grow, right? In this case, we tried all of them or a random group. And in this case, it didn't help, right, in species. But there's still some sort of, what if we only pick the best ones? Yes.
Okay, and just to clarify, when you were creating the synthetic data, you were still identifying species, but you were identifying more words as belonging to the entity species.
I would say that the model doesn't produce like a set of words that would always be a species. Instead, it predicts, given a sentence, is this word a species or not?
Recognize dog and cat
Mhm.
species after you created more sentences would also recognize
Zebrafish.
zebra.
Yeah.
Right? So the benefit is that you get the same performance, but for more words that belong to the entity. Is that correct?
That is a possible benefit simply by the nature that we created samples that maybe have a larger vocabulary, like increasing the vocabulary of what the model's seen. Yeah, that could be one benefit, though typically the models tend to not just look at the actual vocab of the word, but a lot of the prediction has to do with what's around the word. So even if I had the same sentence and I took out the word dog and I put in zebrafish, a model that's never seen zebrafish could still identify it as a species given the context. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Dr. Ghosh.
Really good. So cell line and group name you could potentially improve because your synthetic data is potentially inputting some interesting.
Yes, yes, Rachel. Sure, sure. So species was the most well represented and it performed the best on the, well, I wouldn't say it was the most. It was both well represented and also performed well on our initial baseline. Cell line was, let's go in order of that original slide. So the well represented but performed badly on the baseline was group name. And then cell line was poorly represented and performed poorly on the baseline. So let's see. We sort of have only one question left. Can we just use that synthetic data and not really use any of the authentic data? And we conducted that replace to gen experiment. And what we found was currently, no, you can't just use the synthetic data to produce a model that is good at classifying the entities that you desire, right? There's still a lot of room for improvement. I mean, if you look at, in our case, these two are the only two that had some limited ability to recognize a species, entity type, or any of the entity types with 0.4 and 0.3 on that category. But the other two, compared to their baseline, right, in cell line, they're bad. And in group name, it's also bad. You know, it's not really able to recognize those terms. So there's still room for improvement. And in fact, that's where our future work comes into play. So we're going to repeat the experiments to conduct significance testing, right? You don't want the results that I just presented to you to be taken 100%, right? There's things that you need to do. You need to collect mean. You need to connect standard deviation. You need to tell me these results are not just randomly good. They're good because they're always good, or maybe not, right? Something we need to find out. And so we want to do this sort of repetition. On top of that, we want to do that best 10%, right? Is the helping the model in species, for example, we saw it didn't really help, but maybe if we only pick the best 10 or 20% of synthetic data, we might see an improvement. We did a random 10%, so we want to try maybe the best or most similar. And with this, we would essentially maybe calculate the centroid of the examples, or maybe the centroid of the authentic data we have available, and maybe compute some sort of empirical distance to the synthetic samples, and maybe take the closest ones or something like that. That's just one possible way to implement this future work. We want to do an ablation study on the amount of synthetic data required and study how much synthetic data do you actually need to improve performance. And we want to further prompt in smaller batches to see if we can reduce semantic drift or maybe even quantify it somehow as something we want to explore. We want to adjust that temperature parameter I told you about earlier to get more diverse outputs, or see if we can get more diverse outputs. And then we want to implement a generative replay approach for continual learning. And so, what does this work contribute to the field of computer science? Well, we determined that synthetic data can be generated using GPT-4 in the proper format, and we have allowed the automatic creation of labeled training data for NAR systems. We also evaluated ad hoc and key prompting as two strategies to prompt models to create outputs. We evaluated the distribution of synthetic entities versus authentic entities with our clustering experiments, and we initially evaluated the ratio of synthetic to authentic data. However, an ablation study is still necessary to sort of quantify its impact. And here on the bottom, I've included the code that we used to complete a link to the code that we used to complete all of this research. Currently, it's still private, but this would be the link to the code when it's ready. And then I would like to say a very large thank you to the High Performance Research Computing Core and Dr. Cano, who is a director of facilities over there. He and the work that they did allowed us to actually do any of these experiments. Without these resources, it wouldn't have gotten done. And so I owe them a very big thank you. And I would also like to say thanks to Dr. McInnes, to my research partner, Scott, there. I'd like to say thank you to my committee members, Dr. Chang, Dr. Philpos, Dr. Uruz, and Dr. Ghosh, to my friends in the Nano NLP lab, to my family and friends, and Sarika. And
I do have a question.
And I'll take any questions.
Hi, I do have a question. Hello?
Yes.
So it's safe to say more than
Yes, it's safe to say
All right.
I do more than beep, boop, beep, boop.
I do have a question.
Oh, hold on. I can hear you. Go ahead.
All right, perfect. Sorry about this. So my name is Derek Madon, and I'm the director for data science here at NASA Langley. And Charles, I have to tell you, this was a very, very good, powerful presentation. I was in and out of your presentation a couple of times, and you might have answered this question, but I do want to find out when you took your data set, the example that you took about the cats and the dogs, and moving that data over to cars, right? How do you work with outliers in the data set, in the new data set that you were transitioning to? Because as you learn over data, with data over time, you know, your model will learn to ignore the outliers in the original data set. But when you get to the new data set, those outliers are present. So are we assuming that everything that the primary data set had considered as an outlier also is considered in the new data set? Or are you, again, trying to relearn from the new data set, also keeping in mind the base model that you created? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. So to summarize for everybody in the room who would maybe not be able to hear, we're talking about the effect of outliers present in the data when you do continual learning. So the outliers present in the initial data, you now produce the model, you want to teach it something new. You know, is it able to handle outliers? How does that effect happen when you sort of incrementally expand knowledge and dealing with outliers? Because typically in the traditional sense, a model might learn to ignore outliers, or even in your data pre-processing, technically, you might have removed them or something like that. So how does that affect? Well, so I will tell you that in our survey of literature for continual learning, there were sort of a number of different approaches to actually performing continual learning. So with an outlier present and you train a model, your model might latch onto that outlier. And with generative replay approaches, if your generator is good, eventually the impact of that outlier might be reduced as more realistic synthetic data is produced in each subsequent step, right? If the generator is good at producing regular fake cats and dogs, then the effect of the initial outlier might be reduced in further steps, because in each step, it's only seeing those more regular cats and dogs. There are other approaches, such as things called knowledge distillation, that sort of use a teacher and a student. So the teacher model is the previous model that was trained on dogs and cats, and then you use it to help train the student, which is going to recognize dogs, cats, boats, and cars. And you can actually, as the researcher, control the effect of the teacher and the impact of the previous model to the current model. So if you tie that in with, say, a generative replay or even a traditional replay approach, you might even further be able to control the impact of what the model that was trained on the real data that maybe had outliers actually does to the subsequent student model by sort of controlling its impact, if that makes sense.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I think your presentation was pretty point on, and you picked up a very debatable subject when it comes to synthetic data in our industry. And the fact that you started with some NASA data, I'm thankful to you for considering something which is a practical problem in our world today. So best of luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Dr. Kurgan. Sure. Yes.
Most significant principle parts, I believe.
Yes, correct. No. Yes. Yes.
This is 2 out of 2024.
Yeah.
You should know how much volume.
That's right. That's right. That's true, right? For the audience, we're talking about principal component analysis, and in reducing the dimensions, sort of the principal components produced, it kind of each have a metric that tells you the variance within the data set that they contain. And we took the first two. If you were hopeful, right, the first two might contain a good amount of the variance, and you might be happy with just using those two. But in Dr. Kurgan's point, he's saying that, well, maybe the third one has enough variance or even a good amount of variance that you should have taken that one as well to create a more meaningful result of similarity. So I will say that we will be doing our similarity experiments to quantify them in the full dimensional space to sort of avoid this problem of losing information. And the pictures that we produced, we used two, regardless of the variance, simply to produce some nice pictures to show the audience. Yes, sir. Yes. This is true. So I will say the short answer is the literature in named entity recognition uses F1, and to be consistent, we would need to report it. But doesn't mean that we couldn't also report something else, right? Everybody reports F1, but we know that F1 includes not all of the sort of metrics on that chart. If the audience members remember, I talked about precision and recall, and there was a chart, and I can bring it up for you. If I can, I probably can bring it up to you. Maybe not in a nice way. There it is. Oh, there it was. And I want to present from, thank you. Boom, there it is, right? So of these 4 different zones that you see here, F1 does not report on this white zone that is missing, the true negatives. And so you might think, well, why didn't you report on those, as Dr. Kurgan has just asked? And if you think about what a true negative really means in terms of entity recognition, if I'm trying to recognize a species, a true negative is something that's not a species that I've identified correctly as being not a species. Well, in entity recognition, most things aren't species. And in fact, most things are O. And so we actually capture most of the information we're looking for, given the fact that it's highly imbalanced towards being O with sort of the other 3, right? It's sort of good enough to tell you all that you want to know about the model, since this is going to be mostly me telling the model, did you get the O's right? Since the O's are most prevalent. So I would say that's sort of why we're okay with initially not presenting it. Doesn't mean we couldn't, right? It's sort of one more line of code and we could just produce another metric, but so that's what I would say. Any other questions? Dr. Kirkin again. Sure. The model architecture? Yes. 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 So I would say that DeBerta creates these vector representations, taking order of the sentence as one of many things that is used to produce this output, these vectors. And then when you look at the vectors through the linear and softmax layers, because that vector now sort of has position as one of many things taken into account, you would say, well, the subsequent network that's going to be updated hopefully takes into account position and order of the sentence, and probably a number of other things. Now, I'll tell you that in NER, there is something called a conditional random field, right? A CRF layer that you could add to this, which further takes a look at the data set and sort of looks at, you can use a different type of data called BIO, which includes something called beginning and inside prefixes to these tags. So if I'm a species and I'm two words, the first is a B species and the second is an I species. And with that, for a better example, the CRF would know that I has to always come after a B, right? And that's something that you could add on top of this model to further take into account that not all labels, sort of occur in some random order. If I have the I's, for example, it has to be prefaced by a B or an I. Otherwise, it would be an incorrect prediction. So it's something we would like to add. With continual learning, it becomes slightly difficult to integrate, but it's on the future work list that didn't make it onto the slide. Sure. Yes. Right. Right. And that's right. Yeah, thank you. This is true. This is true. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mom, yes. Sure. 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 Well, to be honest, with continual learning approaches, the idea is that it doesn't stop, right? You would hope that you could just keep adding more information. When it came to our experiments, we found those three entities that sort of matched to those naturally occurring scenarios: high representation, high performance; high representation, low performance; low representation, low performance. And to initially build this foundation, we wanted to just limit the scope to those three. Now, in reality, the hope would be, if you want to create synthetic data for 5 or 6 or 7 entities, your generator can do that. You can add it to your model and you're happy. Maybe that becomes 50 or 60 entities. You can generate for it, you can add it to the model, and the model is able to either learn better. So in this case, if we're traditional, like with these experiments, we would be non-continual learning. They're traditional NER. I have all the data prepared. I train the model over this data, and it produces a model that recognizes whatever's in the data that I've asked it to. So you could ask the generator, I want species, automobiles, cell lines, celestial objects, etc. And then you would produce data. You could mix that in with your current authentic data, and now your model learns those classes. Yeah. Yeah. Rachel. Numbers as in like a... Sure. Well, so there's some pre-processing tricks you can do if you want to sort of generalize the model. Maybe you replace all of the numbers with simply a special character that just says number, because maybe the number itself doesn't specifically matter when you want to recognize it as a number. Now, alternatively, I'll tell you that numbers are relatively easy to recognize. We can use something called a regular expression, and it sort of matches the structure of something that you've given it. And since numbers are digits, you can sort of pick them out relatively easily. But if you wanted to then like replace them, like I said, you could just replace it with a word, maybe in brackets, that just says number. And now we know that in the sentence, in the sequence of words, there was a number there. We didn't necessarily care what it was. But now the sentence for the other labels is still happy, and we were able to obviously replace it. So we knew that there was a number there and we could classify it appropriately. Now, if you wanted that number to be especially like a percent yield, right? You have a percent yield in your experimental setup and you need it to be recognized as a percent yield. You may leave that number in and it's just treated like any other word. A vector is produced for it and then a classification can be made. Yeah.
Okay, last question.
Sure. Yeah.
Like privacy.
Sure.
Could you have people like look at the fake data, like that, I'll try to filter that out. So like, we can look at it and go, okay, well, you didn't really do a good job on that one. So we'll just start that. I think you were touching on it, 10% of doing the Dataset 10%.
Sure. So you could add what I would call as a human kind of in the loop, if you have access to a human, right? We have access to a number of experts in the domain. So we could have had them look over the data, throw out samples that were incorrectly labeled or throw out samples that don't make sense. And maybe that would have improved the quality of our experiment. But the overall idea was we could do it automatically. But in the initial stages, if you have the people and they're willing to do it, it would be probably easier, I would say. If you've written a paper, what's the hardest part of writing a paper? Is it writing the paper? Maybe. But is it going back and looking it over and making sure that it makes sense? Well, that's a little bit easier to do, right? Looking for grammar, checking for grammar, things like that is a little bit easier to do than initially writing the paper. So maybe those specialists that review the output, it's still fast or efficient. It's not time consuming. Maybe we could help. Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, hopefully less.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So let's thank Charles. I'm afraid I have to ask you all to leave. But thank you so very much for coming.
And if everybody on Zoom that is not a member of the committee, thank you for attending, and if you could log off.